The first in the nation contest for the 2020 Democratic primary begins with the Iowa Caucus, set to kick off at 7 p.m. on February 3rd, 2020. So who will win? The short answer is Bernie Sanders. RCP's Iowa tracker has Sanders leading with 24.2 points. That's more than 3 points ahead of Joe Biden. FiveThirtyEight's averages show Sanders with a more modest lead of less than a point. 270 to win shows Sanders up by nearly 4 points. No matter which polls aggregations you trust most, Sanders is clearly leading in the polling, and is therefore the most likely to win the most pledged delegates. So Sanders is the short answer, but there's also a long answer. In this video, I'll talk about the exact number of delegates each candidate is likely to scoop up in Iowa. I'll show the most likely scenario given various polling aggregations, I'll generate a best and worst case scenario projection for each of the candidates, and I'll give you my definitive prediction of how many pledged delegates each candidate will win in Iowa. Hopefully this more extended breakdown will serve as a more robust Iowa predictions video, going well beyond the simple question, who will win? First, let's look at the polling. According to RCP, Bernie Sanders leads with 24.2% support in Iowa, Biden has 21.0%, Buttigieg has 16.8%, and Warren has 14.7%. All other candidates are well below the 15% threshold that would be required to earn a pledged delegate in Iowa, even considering a typical margin of error for these polls, which is around plus or minus 4 points. The numbers are slightly different according to FiveThirtyEight's aggregation. Here Sanders has 22.4%, Biden 21.7%, and Buttigieg 16.3%. Warren has 13.9 points, below the 15% threshold, but within the margin of error. The other candidates are well below. According to 270 to win, Sanders leads with 24.3%, Biden has 20.7%, Buttigieg 17.0%, Warren 14.3%. No other candidate has the potential to make the threshold. We can come up with precise projections by assuming that a given poll or poll aggregation is accurate. So let's start with RCP's polling averages. We can predict the first alignment of caucuses straightforwardly based on the standings of candidates in the polls. If Bernie has 24.2%, he's likely to get around 24.2% in the first alignment. For Biden, that would be 21%. For Buttigieg, it's 16.8%. Warren would get 14.7%, and the numbers continue to shrink from there. The first alignment, of course, does not determine the outcome of a caucus. Generally speaking, candidates with less than 15% will not count as viable, meaning their supporters have to realign. If we take the RCP averages as a model, the supporters of all candidates polling lower than Buttigieg will realign to a more popular candidate. It is of course possible for Elizabeth Warren to become viable if she earns enough new supporters from other unviable candidates. But historically, candidates polling under 15% tend not to earn pledged delegates in Iowa, so we'll assume here that her supporters will realign to Sanders, Biden, and Buttigieg. The second choices of Iowans, whose first choices are not viable, now become extremely important. There are polls on the second choices of likely Democratic primary voters, some limited to Iowa, and others even break down the second choices of voters based on who their first choice is. But second choices can be expected to change as often as first choices, and the polling here really isn't sufficient in my view to give us accurate predictions. So for our purposes here, I'm going to assume that the supporters of non-viable candidates will be redistributed evenly amongst the viable candidates. For the final count based on the RCP standings then, we can expect the share of support to break down like this. Sanders with 39%, Biden with 33.8%, and Mayor Pete with 27.1%. Assuming the final count of support for each candidate translates into a proportional share of the 41 delegates, which has actually not always been the case, but assuming that the RCP data gives us a delegate distribution of 16 delegates for Sanders, 14 for Biden, 11 for Buttigieg. Now, we can repeat this same process for the other polls aggregators. Here is the first alignment distribution we can expect with data from FiveThirtyEight. Here is the realignment we can expect for the final count. And here is the delegate distribution we can expect based on those numbers. Now let's look at what 270 to win's poll aggregations generate. For our first alignment, we are simply copying over the standings in the polls for each candidate. For our second alignment, we drop out the candidates polling under 15 and redistribute the support to viable candidates. And here is the delegate count we can project based on those results. Now, one thing that these projections do not account for is the fact that there is actually a potential for candidates polling just south of 15% to become viable. Typically, the under 15s, as I mentioned, do not earn delegates. But with Warren polling around 14%, 15 is well within the margin of error of most polls. Assuming a margin of error of plus or minus 4 points and her worst polling aggregator average of 13.9 points, Warren's lowest likely result for the first alignment is 9.9 points. That is nowhere near the 15% threshold, meaning she would not likely receive any delegates. Best case scenario for Warren is a first alignment percentage of 18.7%. This would make her viable for delegates, and assuming she gains a reasonable share of support from the supporters of unviable candidates, we can imagine her final count might be as high as 24.9%. That would project a reasonable range maximum of 10 delegates for Warren. Let's do the same calculations for Buttigieg, once again taking his best and worst standings in polls aggregations and assuming a margin of error of plus or minus 4 points. Here, his worst case scenario is a first alignment percentage of 12.3%, a final count of 16.4 points, earning him 7 delegates. His best case scenario is a first alignment percentage of 21.0, a final count of 34.4%, and 14 delegates. Now let's do the same for Joe Biden. His lowest polls average is 20.7 points. Subtracting 4 points gives us 16.7. His highest polls average is 21.7. Adding 4 to account for the margin of error gives us 25.7. So we can expect him to earn in the first alignment somewhere between 16.7 and 25.7. In the second alignment, we can expect this to translate to a range of 22.2 to 42.1. That would give him a delegate range of 9 to 17. Finally, let's look at Bernie Sanders. His worst case scenario is a first alignment percentage of 18.4 points, a final count percentage of 24.5%, and a delegate count of 10. His best case scenario is a first alignment percentage of 28.3 points, a final count percentage of 46.4, and a take home of 19 pledged delegates. The reasonable ranges of each candidate allows us to see this race in context. Sanders is very likely to win Iowa, but the overlapping ranges reflect the fact that this is still very much anyone's game. Make no mistake, it's a tight race, and many very different outcomes are possible. We can also use these ranges to help generate a number that is going to be a factor in my prediction. Let's add to our chart the averages of each of these ranges, then round down to whole numbers such that they add up to 41 total delegates. We'll call this number the range average. To produce my prediction, I'd like to mix the results of the range averages, the RCP projection, FiveThirtyEight projection, and the 270 to win projection. Averaging all 4 of these figures produces my final prediction. 15 pledged delegates for Bernie Sanders, 14 for Joe Biden, 11 for Pete Buttigieg, and 1 for Elizabeth Warren. No pledged delegates for any other candidate. Let me know how many delegates you think each candidate will earn in the comments down below. Then after Monday night, we'll be able to see how accurate our predictions were once we have the answer to that very big question, who will win?